This week I'm joined by Will Davies. He's a political economist at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's a regular contributor to The Guardian and the London Review of Books. He's the author of many books on politics and society, including The Limits of Neoliberalism, The Happiness Industry, and Nervous States. Today we're discussing his latest book, This Is Not Normal, The Collapse of Liberal Britain, which is here. First of all, Will, I just want to ask about you. How are you doing at the moment?
I'm sort of hanging in there. I mean, I've got used to the strange new teaching environment, which was a bit of a pretty difficult to get our heads around to start with. But and kids are back at school, so that's a much more normal than things were back in April and May. So, but I mean, we're speaking on a day when the news headlines are pointing towards some increasingly grim the few weeks over what awaits us. So it's not looking particularly rosy right now as far as the broader news is concerned.
So in 1935, George Dangerfield wrote The Strange Death of Liberal England. In 2020, you've published The Collapse of Liberal Britain. Now, what do you see as the essential aspects of liberal Britain? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what the book addresses is a series of developments that were released by the Brexit referendum result in summer of 2016, which, I mean, hopefully the book makes clear that these forces that were at large in society weren't suddenly sort of invented in June 2016, although I think that clearly they the extent to which they took aim at the European Union specifically was something that was relatively recent, as the polls show. But what I'm talking about in terms of the collapse of liberal Britain is that there were dramatic political gains to be made both by Brexiteers and then subsequently by Boris Johnson in challenging aspects of the constitution, aspects of the mainstream media, aspects of the rule of law, I mean, ultimately, and of the independent civil service that effectively provide I suppose, the political infrastructure within which liberal democracy has historically taken place, at least in recent decades. And I think that although, I mean, obviously Britain has an unwritten constitution and it has had problems with its mass media for a long time, and the power of its tabloid media has made it harder to sustain kind of reasoned public argument about certain issues or evidence-based public argument about certain issues. But nevertheless, I suppose there was in place up until around about 2016 just the bare bones of a kind of consensus around the basic rules of the game, I suppose, that parties will adhere to, and which constrain people in how they behave, the sorts of arguments they make, the sorts of enemies they target, and so on. And I mean, in a way, what I'm referring to is otherwise known as populism, which is movements of sort of incendiary outsiders, which take aim not just at their sort of rivals within the political arena, but at the very foundations and norms of the political arena.
And something that's central to the book is obviously the corrosive impacts of neoliberalism. And there's been lots of definitions and conceptions provided in the literature. So David Harvey and Paul Mason even, and Quinn Slobodian. How do you understand neoliberalism?
Well, this is something which I discuss in my first book, The Limits of Neoliberalism. In that, I offer a definition of neoliberalism, which is that it is the extension and enforcement of market-based principles and metrics and techniques. And when I say market-based principles and techniques and metrics, I'm talking about the spread of things like new public management in the public sector, of targets, of audit, the way universities are encouraged to behave as enterprises in competition with one another in league tables and so on. So what I've defined as neoliberalism is the way, not just about how the kind of the free market kind of expands and the state contracts, because I think, as many people have noted, that's not actually really how sort of actually existing neoliberalism has worked, but how non-market institutions, including states, including things like universities, including the arts, for instance, and social relationships, become reconfigured around a kind of market-based template of what good, rational, laudable behaviour is. And in particular, in my own work on this, I focus particularly on how neoliberals, and this goes the whole way back to the thinking of people like Friedrich Hayek and others, treat competition and competitiveness as the most important virtues of liberal systems of one kind or another. And it's not just markets that exhibit competition and competitiveness. It's something that can be driven into things like the education system. It's the way in which audit takes place is not simply to try and uphold kind of truth and accountability, but to try and expose relative the relative merits of, so, rather than saying, is this school kind of doing its job properly, the question is kind of how does it compare to the others? Is it better or worse? Is it kind of rising or falling? Now, this is an important part of my argument in this new book that we're talking about, because effectively what this does is to replace a public sphere which is transparent to its own actors, if you like. So the classical or ideal typical public sphere as imagined by someone like Jürgen Habermas, and this is always a kind of in some way utopia, because it never quite is never quite realized, but you could say it's a kind of it's a principle of how the liberal public sphere works, is one in which parties have some transparency to one another. This is in some ways how also someone like Hannah Arendt talks about political action, that parties are in some ways transparent to one another, they're visible to one another, that they have some regulatory principle of equality in the public sphere to make arguments that will be assessed on their merits rather than on the standing and status of the person making them. And that this is the basis on which reason operates under conditions of liberal modernity. Again, never perfectly realized, but this is what Habermas sees emerging in the early salons and coffee shops of early modern Europe, and something which I suppose he ultimately believes needs resuscitating in the face of kind of organized industrial capitalism. What neoliberalism does is to, in some ways, replace that model of a public sphere with a system of rating and of ranking, where effectively the question of which arguments rise up and which ones fall down is a question of how many clicks they get on them, to what extent do they market themselves in an attractive fashion. Politicians that prosper in today's media ecology are those that draw as much attention towards themselves. In some ways, what social media has done to our public sphere is to push a neoliberal logic of economization and marketization into a whole new area of non-market life, because after all there's no sort of actual price signal or price mechanism going on in social media, so it's still not really kind of configured as a market in a literal sense. But in a way what we all are constantly doing is having to kind of market ourselves in ways that draws the greatest number of clicks and likes and ratings, and ultimately produces these kind of zero-sum games of competition and competitiveness that have been of such, really provoked a lot of excitement for some Austrian economists such as Joseph Schumpeter and others, where effectively sort of triumph involves the kind of defeat of rivals. And I mean, in a way, Trump is the ultimate manifestation of a reconfiguration of a public sphere around a logic of both entrepreneurship, but also of the quest for, I suppose, investment via attention, if you like.
And the book's about Britain, but to what extent are the developments that we've seen in the United States similar to the ones we've seen here? Are they linked?
Well, I think, the United States is a more acute example of, particularly in relation to the media. I think the other element which I'm interested in the book, the book is kind of is ambivalent about liberalism in the sense that the book is, I think, liberalism has not understood itself sufficiently in order to defend itself sufficiently. The aspect of liberalism that I would offer a sort of two cheers for, or one cheer for, is what is sometimes called liberal pluralism, which is the idea that, partly as in the I suppose in sort of one of the most famous principles of liberal politics is that of the separation of powers in the state, that the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature are separate from each other. And that's obviously something that the US state historically has been very proud of. I mean, we can see the extent to which the Republican Party has kind of, through kind of reconceiving of itself as a kind of war machine, really, has kind of abandoned respect for the idea of a kind of, you know, the Supreme Court, what we've seen with the with recent events in American politics, that the Supreme Court is now seen as an explicitly political tool, which in some ways is a kind of, you know, you could say that's a kind of making a wake up to something that has always been the case. Where I think the book is, what I'm interested in, I suppose, is partly the collapse occasioned by neoliberalism of the idea of there being separate domains of public life. And in particular, I think the most crucial one of the collapse of pluralism that we've seen in the UK over recent years, but I think is much more acute in the United States, is how politics and the media, and in some ways business, have sort of collapsed into each other. So once politics and the media collapse into each other, then effectively people, and one of the sort of symptoms of this is that people give up really trusting either. So they give up trusting, they believe that all journalists are liars and they believe all politicians are liars, and that these are the two of the most important sort of trends in the sort of crisis of trust and crisis of credibility of liberal public spheres over the last 30 or 40 years is the way in which both journalists and politicians have their credibility has sort of collapsed in tandem with one another, because they're no longer seen as being adequately distinct from one another. And the British symptom of this is that we have a journalist as Prime Minister, and his closest allies are both former journalists of Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove. In the United States, I think it's far worse, where the idea that you would regulate your media for the public interest is anathema to American politics because of the Second Amendment. The idea that you sort of regulate speech is seen as being a sort of clearly a bad and dangerous thing to many Americans. But the symptom of that is clearly the Fox News phenomenon, the talk radio phenomenon, and then obviously there's the kind of entire sort of Wild West world of YouTube and Facebook, where kind of anything goes. But what is it that has been destroying American democracy, or certainly American liberalism, and I think it sort of latterly has kind of come to the shores of Britain, is I suppose a sort of an emphasis on sort of market deregulation has kind of flowed first of all into the realm of the media, and that sort of kind of that sort of sewage that has sort of flowed through that has then eventually kind of inevitably arrived in the political realm, where effectively, you know, you get the Trump phenomenon, where you can sort of say anything and frankly it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, what will eventually do for Trump, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen next week, but it won't be that he's a liar. I mean, that's not going to be that's not Trump's problem. And equally, I think it's not Boris Johnson's problem that he's a liar. And this is the sort of, you know, this is clearly a major problem for how liberalism functions, if sort of the norms of accountability of public speech basically are sort of treated as sort of bogus and fraudulent, and then people can kind of, that speech itself ceases to really matter.
So you've got some very quotable phrases in here, like the new type of celebrity evaluator. So you talk about Piers Morgan, Brendan O'Neill, Simon Cowell. And you also talk about the sort of new type of celebrity rationalists, so the sort of Toby Youngs and the Richard Dawkins of this world. Now, do you think they're a product of social media, or do you think it's a sort of general denigration of the quality of discourse in this country?
Well, I think that both of those things, and I don't want to be too sort of romantic or dewy-eyed or nostalgic for an era of sort of, you know, when good and proper liberalism worked. I'm trying to sort of describe something rather than just decry or to mourn something. But I think what's interesting about those cases is that once, to use the example of rationalism, once rationality becomes a kind of a sort of a new form of identity politics, almost, where you have these, the Steven Pinker kind of, Sam Harris, these kinds of people who turn. And I think the turning point for this particular development was really with the Iraq War, where you got the development of this Christopher Hitchens public intellectual polemicist, who basically turned kind of the West, as they would proudly call it, into a kind of weapon which would kind of cognitively kind of hammer those who kind of defended other cultures, other belief systems, and so on. But that I think once once reason gets turned into that sort of a basis for polemic, then it's no longer the basis for consensus and the kind of public deliberation that someone like Habermas still hoped Western modernity could be, or modernity rather, could be founded on. And equally, I think that, in a sense, my point about the likes of Piers Morgan and others is that does to the ideal of criticism what someone like Dawkins does to the ideal of reason, is that effectively the spectacle becomes, you're good, you're bad. This, again, to go back to the sort of, I suppose, the some of the kind of the key figures in the development of a vision of liberal philosophy, anyway. And you think of, so for Immanuel Kant, the critic performed a very important role in, particularly in the aesthetic public sphere, in the identification of beauty. But I think that more broadly, that in a sense that judgment and criticism become absolutely key for, as someone like Arendt read into the works of Kant, for the judgment of good political action as well, and for effectively, without judgment, the contingency of modernity becomes something that is unmanageable and turns into a kind of chaos. And then, in a way, we've ended up sort of turning judgment into this this kind of spectacle of the sort of celebrity critic that you quote me talking about. Now, is that social media? I mean, I think it's partly a sort of general kind of, the spread of kind of media spectacle isn't confined to social media. I mean, it's also a feature of 24/7 news. I mean, in the United States, it's been long predates social media, that you sort of turn on your TV and there are people just sort of shouting at each other on the screen or on the radio and so on. But certainly, I think what social media has done quite a lot of is to create these forces of what some people call fandom and anti-fandom, of sort of, that effectively that people who sort of, you follow someone because they heap praise on something or they damn something. And, I mean, a lot of what makes Trump such a kind of spectacular public force is the power and the passion with which he condemns things. And I think that sort of, there's a kind of visceral, spectacular quality to condemnation and praise, such that they no longer really kind of do anything which actually describes the world, but more sort of stage a certain kind of emotive performance.
Where do you situate Dominic Cummings in this whole story? We've obviously seen the Barnard Castle incident earlier this year, and this is also a man who wanted weirdos and misfits to enter the heart of government. Now, where do you situate Cummings? Well,
from what I understand of Cummings, and I mean, I'm not someone who's spent hours poring over his blog posts, as some have, but I mean, obviously he spent some time. The interesting, what's bizarre about Cummings is, so he's a technocrat, basically. Like, he's someone who he's an autodidact who spent a lot of time reading up on some quite esoteric scientific ideas and pieces of rationalist ideas drawn from physics and elsewhere. So, I mean, in some ways, he's kind of to go back to what we were saying earlier, he's someone who kind of, is obviously has some sympathies with a kind of a some of the sort of Steven Pinker kind of worldview that that science has the answers. There's a, you know, we know he holds the humanities in some disdain. He holds a certain kind of liberal elite in some disdain, who he sees as being a kind of rather kind of enclosed world of people who are not sort of cognitively able or culturally inclined to open themselves up to the teachings of the natural sciences and mathematics and data analytics and so on. So he seems to be fueled by a certain amount of resentment. What's kind of curious is sort of why he's in politics at all, because there are a lot of people like that who were and these sorts of places who basically believe that government is not very good at doing things. So it's kind of, he's obviously got a rather odd vocation. I mean, there's one of the essays in the book, which is a kind of written in the summer of 2019 as British politics was sort of still completely kind of stuck with kind of, there were still sort of four parties roughly stuck on kind of about 20% of the vote in the, well, actually I think the Tories by that point had pulled ahead, but still had no way of getting a general election, and were about to confront the Supreme Court. But anyway, I wrote right in there, you know, that Cummings's ideas probably aren't that uncommon in some areas of the tech sector, and certainly are not that uncommon in certain corners of, you know, a kind of that sort of, you know, some of these people who are interested in game theory and mathematical psychology and aspects of behavioral economics, and believe that data analytics can basically kind of should really replace the social sciences and possibly even the humanities. It's not, I mean, this ideology is out there, but quite why he sort of got it in for Whitehall and the civil service, other than, sometimes I wonder about Cummings, you know, maybe he's really kind of, maybe he really cares. Maybe he really believes he can make a big difference and produce much better government. But I mean, why anyone would end up with that level of, I mean, there have been technocrats before who have gone into Downing Street and believed that, you know, they can change things. And probably in some ways the precedent for this would be sort of Tony Blair in a way, because Blair kind of, the thing which, I mean, until 9/11, the thing which Blair felt most passionate about was public service reform and modernisation. And he was the thing which really kind of seemed to get him out of bed in the morning, was the idea that you could bring a similar level of quality to public services as existed in the private sector, which is a kind of a neoliberalism, but it's a neoliberalism that ultimately aims to serve, you know, the general public. And I think Cummings is what most people came out of Cummings' job, people like Jeff Mulgan or Matthew Taylor, these sorts of New Labour sort of policy gurus, came out of that job basically convinced that there was a limit to what you could really sort of achieve from Downing Street because of the sort of, you know, the scale and complexity of Whitehall. Cummings obviously is enough of a narcissist or an egotist as to believe that he can do differently. I mean, I don't think of him as the sheer sort of danger that some people do, but clearly there's something, you know, clearly he believes in a, I suppose intellectually it's a vision that comes via Austrian economics, and some people would trace it back further to Nietzsche. I mean, I think apparently there are a few references to Nietzsche on his blog, but that modernity and progress doesn't happen, that, you know, must in some ways devour its own conditions and its own the norms of innovation engulfs its own preconditions in some ways. This is the kind of a vision of capitalism as evolutionary and as disruptive and potentially, you know, quite harmful along the way, in the sense of not being able to make an omelette without breaking a lot of eggs. And I think that clearly he wants to break a lot of eggs. There is a kind of a history to this thinking, which kind of veers in the history of neoliberalism, veers between a sort of a romantic cult of the entrepreneur that the Austrian neoliberals subscribe to, and then a highly rationalist mathematical equivalent that kind of, you know, the Rand Corporation and early game theorists and some of the Chicago School of Economics subscribe to. And Cummings seems to kind of, you know, I think what data science has done is to sort of bring some of these two things together by making people think, you know, that we can now sort of spot the trends within the numbers that kind of almost kind of bring the inner logic of chaos to light.
Well, the book's a big part of it is Brexit, of course. So I'd like to get a bit more into that. Why do you think it came about? Do you think it was the product of an internal party management exercise, or do you think it was in the making for a long time?
Well, I think we know that obviously the Conservative Party had an unresolved problem with Europe the whole way back to the Thatcher era. I think, I mean, one of the essays in which the book ends with talks about that the kind of 1986 was a kind of turning point for the Conservative Party, because that was when the free market, the European Single Market Act was passed. It was also when the Big Bang happened in the City of London. It was also when Thatcher was really at her peak, and effectively the kind of that was when Europe sort of delivered. I mean, in a way, kind of the vision of a market into the Conservative Party. In a sense, by that point, the Conservative Party's ambitions in terms of market integration, financial freedom, and international integration of markets were achieved in a way. Like that was the sort of that was really the kind of high point of conservative sympathies for the European project. And from then on, it was kind of downhill from 1986 onwards. And obviously, Thatcher became increasingly Eurosceptic, and Major was undone by his backbenchers. So you could say that the Conservative Party had a 30-year period in which it had been sort of grappling with this problem. The polls show that the number of people, I mean, this poll has been kind of shared quite widely, the number of people who consider Europe to be one of the biggest problems facing the UK were absolutely minimal, right up to the point where Cameron announced the referendum in early 2016. I mean, and then from early 2016 onwards, it just kind of went up and up and up and up, and it shot up kind of during the campaign season over the course from the spring of 2016 through to June 2016. It was still going up and up and up and up. So you have a sort of a kind of a controversy that was undoubtedly one that had been kind of impossible for the Conservative parties to deal with for 30 years, but effectively sort of externalized into the public, but with the help, crucially, of the tabloids and right-wing newspapers that wanted this argument to happen. So there were resentments that were at large across British society. There was, I think, a strong anti-London sentiment that I think makes it a lot more sense than an anti-Brussels sentiment. And I think some of the conflicts that have been discussed at length in relation to populism of generational differences, graduate versus non-graduate, these sorts of things we now know are the kind of key fault lines. I mean, of course, there was a lot of attention to the left behind ex-industrial towns and former mine coalfields of South Wales and the northeast, and these sorts of things. Those were quite eye-catching, and my eyes were caught by them as well immediately after the vote. I mean, the first essay in the book is something that I wrote on the 24th of June 2016, which was, I mean, everyone was like, my God, look at what's happened in the northeast, look at what's happened in South Wales. These are Labour heartlands that have voted kind of nearly 70% for Leave. And so that was very eye-catching. But then it was later when people began to realise there was huge swathes of the south and the southeast of basically quite prosperous, wealthy people who were sort of standard, regular baby boomer Tories, quite well off, but they just sort of like, sod it. We've had enough of this version of modern life. And I think that some of that resentment needs to be seen as a resentment towards New Labour, towards London, towards the successful multicultural project of London, but also the extreme wealth that was developing in London. I mean, the logic of inequality doesn't just operate between the top and the bottom of society. In fact, I think in some ways the sort of failure of Corbynism shows that it doesn't really necessarily work like that. Often it's people feeling jealous and resentful towards people who are within their line of sight and are not that far above them, in the sense, if you're living in a kind of Sevenoaks and you're a sort of retiree, and you sort of see London kind of sort of taking off into the kind of global stratosphere as everybody was sort of celebrating from the kind of late 90s onwards, there's a slight sense of, well, actually, what happens to England? What happens to us? What happens to the ordinary people? And I think that some of those cultural and emotional and psychological forces were at large in society. And I think that, frankly, they got sort of thrust onto the Brexit debate relatively late in the day. I think that it's really quite in the last few months. And then, of course, we know that, you know, part of the power of what Cummings did and what Vote Leave did was to carry on sort of turning up the wick right up to in the last few hours. I mean, it's known that the you know, when Facebook and or was it Vote Leave or whoever had to release the campaign content that they'd been using in the last few hours before the vote, and certainly Leave.eu, which was the sort of, you know, kind of rather sort of less savoury partner to the whole thing. But there were, you know, in the last few hours, there were these images of this is how they treat donkeys in Spain, joins the European Union, and this is how, you know, this is what they, you know, these sorts of incendiary kind of emotive, basically kind of fake news kind of items were sort of distributed right at the last minute. So it was a kind of a, right from sort of January 2016, the whole way through to June 2016, it was a masterclass in how to kind of to play public sentiment in what can basically be described to a large extent as propaganda, but, you know, speaking to kind of political affects and cultural sensibilities that nevertheless had been sort of sedimented over the previous 30 years.
And you do get to COVID in the afterword of the book. You managed to get it in there. And obviously the main story since the summer has been the collapse of the test, trace and isolate system. The government's outsourced it to private firms. Do you see this pandemic as being the sort of the last stage of neoliberalism? Do you think it's in trouble?
I mean, obviously, it depends what you mean by neoliberalism. That's whatever. I think that the obviously one thing which we know has happened, but this predates COVID, is that governments have realised that the bond markets aren't as fierce as they used to be. So the justification for austerity, which was, you know, a lot of people pointed out was bogus all along, but it was possible for George Osborne to say, if we don't cut spending on things like the welfare state, then we're going to get punished and we're going to end up paying these huge interest rates to borrow money and so on. That argument is we no longer hear that argument. And that's because the government is currently borrowing at effectively a sort of 0% of interest. So governments are now borrowing in ways that were unimaginable since World War II, effectively. And this is obviously a major issue in terms of material political economy. I think that in terms of the ideology of neoliberalism, I mean, first of all, it's worth noticing that, of course, the Conservative Party's public support hasn't really fallen significantly. I mean, this is maybe more to do with Brexit than to do with anything else. But what we're not kind of seeing, I think, at the moment is a kind of the development of an alternative vision of the state or of politics. I think that, I mean, what Corbynism did in a sort of valuable way was to open up arguments about the relationship between the state and industry by talking about things like the Green New Deal. Also to kind of offer a version of a left populism which was founded around ideas of democracy and kind of active mobilization of people rather than of sort of pure targeting of enemies. Although, of course, these different versions of populism can get dangerously close to each other in certain ways. And I think that at the moment that's obviously being kind of put to bed by Labour, and that I think means that at some point those discussions are going to have to happen again, because I mean at the moment we can't kind of go forwards with this sort of version of the state that nobody really believes in, and yet in some ways kind of we haven't really got an alternative. I think to go back to what I was saying earlier about neoliberalism, I mean one of the there's a line I use about neoliberalism in my first book that I think it's become maybe my only kind of quoted line of my writing, which is that neoliberalism is the disenchantment of politics by economics. And people kind of seem to like the sort of pithiness of this line. And I think that if you think of it, neoliberalism as the kind of replacement of political relationships and rituals and institutions by economic contracts and transactions and exchanges and forms of competition, the effect of neoliberalism in the state is the creation of well, privatization initially, then you have PFI under John Major, and you get this kind of gradual sort of hollowing out of the state, as the political scientist Rod Rhodes was writing about this in the 1990s, of a sort of what you call governing without government, where effectively the sort of responsibility of the state end up getting kind of farmed out in all directions, and contractors and PFIs and this sort of thing. Now, that aspect of neoliberalism has been utterly rampant during the pandemic. We know this in terms of the, and people have, I mean, George Monbiot has been writing about this. Other people have been kind of trying to expose what's been going on. What's different, though, I think, and this is where, in a sense, populism kind of gets layered upon neoliberalism, is that, in some ways, having kind of economized the state in all of these different ways, those relationships now are being kind of repoliticized in certain ways, but not in ways that is kind of democratic or concerned with kind of the public interest. They're being repoliticized in terms of the extent to which contractors and donors and outsourcing companies have a certain kind of proximity to Downing Street and to Vote Leave, and in a way that the allies, seen as political allies to the executive branch of government, becomes a basis on which they get awarded these contracts. So this is what the Good Law Project of Jolyon Morn and others are trying to look into, these contracts, because these contracts a lot of the time don't seem to be abiding by the standard neoliberal principle of some kind of value for money or compulsory competitive tendering. Not universally, before I get sued, but but there are quite a few of these contracts that we know are being handed out on the basis of sort of the chumocracy, as it gets called. So this is where neoliberalism, founded on a kind of ubiquity of economics and of market contract, potentially then collapses into clientelism and the kind of, ultimately the sort of Orbanite project of using and Trumpite way of using business, not as a basis for injecting value for money and competitiveness and all these kind of neoliberal virtues, when the executive, or providing the kind of supportive kind of the foot soldiers of the executive, not really the foot soldiers, more like the kind of, the strategic allies of the executive. And that's a kind of, a repoliticization that is not a desirable one. I mean, in some ways, you'd be better off kind of sticking to a much more rigid kind of marketization than a repoliticization, which converts, which muddies the distinction between state and business in ways that is primarily about furthering the kind of strategic political objectives of the executive.
I won't keep you for much longer. I've got two more, I think. Now, the attack on liberalism that you're talking about in the book, but there's also that strand of academia, I don't know how small it is, but it's the sort of Eric Kaufman, Matthew Goodwin kind of academic group, where they're saying that there's an attack on the universities in terms of, woke ideology and so on. What's your assessment of what they're saying?
Well, I think they don't define themselves as liberals necessarily. Some people of that mentality might call themselves classical liberals. Seems to have become the phrase that people who are sort of supporters of free speech and so on would argue. I've written a bit about the kind of free speech debates myself as well, which I think the first thing to say is that a lot of the problems that are identified here are grossly exaggerated, and with the help of the press. I work in a university that is Goldsmiths, which is probably, if you had to get Toby Young or Douglas Murray to name their vision of the most woke kind of academic institution, they'd probably say Goldsmiths. And people take a certain pleasure in watching the crisis of the humanities as it's kind of unfolding under some political pressure. And frankly, I honestly don't recognise what I read in the Telegraph, the Times, and the Mail, and and on Eric Kaufmann's Twitter feed, or in Unheard and Quillette. I honestly don't recognise it. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's. Now the question is then sort of, is it motivated by something? I mean, and you get into kind of good faith, bad faith kind of distinctions that everyone on Twitter is always using. I mean, some of those people feel like they are kind of embattled, I suppose, in the sense that they want to kind of defend the point of view of what they consider to be a kind of, a sort of, I suppose, a kind of nativist view of that is critical, not given the right to do so. I think one of the problems, and this is the reason Kaufmann and Goodwin have come under particular attack, primarily from their own discipline, is some of the shoddiness of some of the kind of, the way in which 1 minute it's a sort of they're claiming to purely be sort of number crunchers, and the next minute they're operating in a kind of space of kind of extra scholarly, sort of non-scholarly spaces of argument, as places like Quillette and others have enabled, which will sort of turn fire against the very notions of kind of academic discipline and conventions and so on. So I think that there's a lot of kind of internal contradictions there. Do I think that the left or aspects of, for want of a better term, identity politics poses a problem to liberalism? Well, explicitly it does, in the sense that it, in certain respect, I mean, the left has obviously historically has long been opposed to liberalism, whether it be the Marxist critique of classical political economy, or the emphasis on the way liberal political theory has been blind to its own embodied expressions and its own assumptions of white male identity much of the time. So in that sense, there's a kind of healthy attempt to expose underlying power politics that liberalism has historically refused to confront and engage with. I do think that, broadly speaking, I have no time for the way in which this anti-woke kind of politics is organized with the help of newspapers, online free speech activists, and so on. That doesn't mean that there aren't, areas of I don't think it goes on within the academy so much as sometimes often when some academics get outside of the academy. Clearly, there are tactics of protest and tactics of argument that have made reasoned dialogue has become harder to sustain deliberately in certain respects. So in that respect, I think to go back to what I was saying earlier about the Habermasian public sphere, there are many people who on the left who don't want to see that thrive because they think it's an unhelpful delusion and a fantasy. I suppose I would argue that that at the moment we need to defend it from a more dangerous set of fantasies that are developing on the right, which are that that effectively I think universities are themselves being threatened by political forces, which I think in some ways are more important than that I think that in that sense, I think there are aspects of the left that I think need to join forces, not with the sort of free speech brigade or anything like that, but at least with the defense of university institutions potential efforts, a sort of Orbanite politics, which wants to intrude into universities and tell us what we can research and what we can teach. This is, ultimately what I think is what we all need to be. We need to join forces against, as well as participate in other arguments.
All right, I'll finish with this one. So we've got the Trump election coming up, but other than that, the situation looks very bleak. How optimistic are you for the future?
I'm not. I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic for the future. I think that the pandemic is sort of is wearing people down, and it has no. The problem with the pandemic is it has no mitigate. There's nothing. I suppose the one source of hope in the pandemic is that it might be a sort of. It might be the kind of wake up call to the broader ecological catastrophe that to move fast enough to actually get people to wake up on its own accord. And there is, I was reading there's a good piece by Dipesh Chakrabarty about, linking the pandemic back to the great acceleration of what is sometimes called the Anthropocene, and trying to, think through what this is telling us about the nature of the state of global capitalism. I think that there's potentially a kind of educational function to the pandemic, but other than that, it has no mitigating. There's nothing. It doesn't contain any sources of hope within it. It just seems to, unless you're an investor in surveillance capital, and so I think that makes life extremely difficult. I think that generationally and demographically there are sources of hope, because I think that the vision that we can alleviate some of our most pressing social and environmental problems through the closure of borders, through the search for cultural and ethnic homogeneity. I think eventually, I think the forces, the demographic and generational forces are mitigated against that. So in that sense, some of the kind of forces of Trumpism and of nationalism are a kind of howl of rage about the fact that actually they are kind of, they are shrinking in some respects. And of course, the Republican Party doing everything they can to sort of destroy as much in the meantime via the Supreme Court and that kind of thing. So the question then is sort of how much is left politically by the time some of these kind of incipient generational demographic forces kind of get their hands on power. But I think that the decade after the financial crisis of 2008, and then leading up to the pandemic, will look like a historical tragedy in some respects, because I think that there was no serious attempt to actually reform the economy, and that the urge for dramatic change ended up being channeled into kind of fictitious imagined communities of the right, and that was, I think that's a sort of real tragedy of what happened there. But I think that I think that what people want could end up becoming clearer, and what people want could end up being closer to what I think we actually need. I mean, we don't need things like Brexit. I'm not some sort of like passionate kind of pro-European Remainer. I'm sort of, can get used to whatever we have to, I don't have any particular kind of love of the European Union. It's clear to me that Brexit is a complete sort of absurd distraction from things that we actually need, and so on. And I think that equally, like the recognition that actually immigration is a social good, certainly an economic good, but it's actually a social good in lots of respects, also seems to really have taken strong hold in, as far as attitudinal surveys suggest, in this country over the last 4 years. Maybe that was a positive effect of the EU referendum in itself.
Okay, Will Davies, great to talk to you. Thank you.
Great, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.